Well, good evening, everybody.
Puts the pressure on.
Welcome. Special welcome to Australia's Chief Scientist, Professor Ian Chubb. There's also some of my equivalents from the other states. Special welcome. We've got a meeting tomorrow of the Forum of Chief Scientists, which has given us an ideal opportunity to arrange this public lecture. I'd like to quickly thank Vicky Tyndall, who's done a lot of the mechanics of getting this organised, and also to Professor Steve Wesling, who was out the front a moment ago, up the back, who's the director of this new establishment. And thank you, Steve, for hosting us here this evening. It's really excellent and an ideal opportunity for such a wide range of people to come and be inside and experience this great new addition and investment in South Australia. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ian. He's been, I think, having quite some influence in Canberra. We would have liked him to have had a little bit more last week. I'm sure he'll probably have something to say about that. But I always enjoy listening to Ian's talks. And in my time, I should have introduced myself. I'm Don Bursell, I'm South Australia's Chief Scientist. And in my time in this role, I've really valued the interaction with Ian. And as we've developed our state science and research strategy, approved by Cabinet in January this year, I've tried to, along with my colleagues from the Science Council and other key stakeholders, tried to align that as much as possible to make it complementary to what I was aware he was trying to do at the national level. So it's really great to have him here. It's the first time that I've been able to host the Forum of Chief Scientists. So Ian, of course, is well known to many South Australians because he was the Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University for some years, and then went over to take on the same role at the Australian National University in Canberra. And on his retirement from that role in 2011, he moved into this current position of Australia's Chief Scientist. So Ian, thank you. If you could come up and give us your speech.
Thanks, Tom. So, thank you, Don. How do you know I didn't have any influence? Maybe it's all the fruits of my labours. No, I don't. I do want to get out tonight, so I won't claim it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be back in Adelaide. I did spend all up about 11 years of my working life here. I started out, or when I came back from England, I started out as a young academic at Flinders in what was then a brand new medical school. And I remember walking into what was my designated laboratory, and it was an empty room with one sink in it, and the sink was in the wrong place. So the first thing I had to do was get some money from somewhere to get the sink moved to where we could actually use it. And during that period of, I think, all up 6 years, the Flinders Medical School, but also, of course, Flinders and the relationship with the other institutions in South Australia really grew quite a lot. So some years after that, I came back as Vice-Chancellor at Flinders, where I spent 6 enjoyable years, and then got seduced off to the ANU. But I do remember my time here very fondly. They were good times, and I guess in part it was because I was young. And all my joints worked, and I could walk up that hill at Flinders from the medical centre to the staff bar, which I would never do now. I'd never be able to do now, but in those days we could almost run up on a Friday night and come back in a different condition. But so I do have very fond memories, and I remember particularly the advertiser. And you note that I put it in a different sentence from fondly, but I do remember the advertiser, and the advertiser once had this piece in it that was describing what a great place South Australia was. It was a really withered place, and I can't remember the year, but it would have been in the middle to late 80s. and middle to late 90s, and Adelaide was this great place that everybody should want to live in and all the rest of it. And they described it in some detail, and they produced a list of all the things that they thought were great about Adelaide, and with great pride and great flourish they announced that all 3 Vice-Chancellors were women. And I know that you might not be sure of what I am, and I know that appearances can be quite deceiving, but there were only 2 Vice-Chancellors who were women and me. And I guess that I've always been suspicious of journalists ever since, and I want to encourage you all not to believe everything you read, and I guess I'm a living proof of that. But of course the amusing thing about that was that on the following Monday I had to open a conference in South Australia which was on equity and equity of access, and so I proudly opened the conference declaring myself to be Australia's best kept secret, the cross-dresser of the millennium who had fooled everything, including his wife and daughters, for so long. But anyway, we had as a family, some good times in Adelaide, and I always enjoy coming back here and doing whatever it is that I have to do. I certainly don't seek to prove that I'm a male. I wouldn't know how to do that. To talk about what you've probably come to talk about, and not my reminiscing of what it used to be like here, I just remind you that in recent weeks we've all been urged to think about the destiny of our country, and destiny has been used quite often in the context, and we've been prevailed upon to think not about ourselves but about our country, and not dissimilar from famous words that John F. Kennedy uttered many decades ago. Don't think about yourself but think of your country. And we need to think about what we do, or indeed what we don't do, that's fair or whether it's unfair, on future generations. And I think it's that expression, on future generations, that I'd like to sort of come back to intermittently through the rest of this talk, because I think it's an important concept, and I think we need to extend it beyond the notion of getting a debt under control, because it, if we don't, would be unfair on future generations. So in that sort of context about the destiny of our country, and to think not just about ourselves but our country, I'd like to share some insights from my part of the world with you today. And of course that means in this instance the science part of my world. And more importantly, I want to ask you to think about what we need to do to win our children the future, our children and our grandchildren, indeed the future that we would want for them. And I suspect that most of you who have children and likely to have grandchildren would think as I do, and that is that we want the world that we hand on to that coming generation and those coming generations to be better than the one that we ourselves inherited. It should be, it can be, but it's really up to us to make sure that it is. So I subscribe to Shakespeare's understanding of destiny. And Shakespeare said, and I quote, "Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves." And I think that's right. I think it is up to us. It's up to us to grasp the nettle and say that there are things that could be done, there are things that should be done, and that we have a view of what those things will lead to. It's not fiddling with a little bit of policy here and touching a little bit of policy up there and worrying about something over here. What's it all for? And unless we're willing to think about it, articulate it, own it and work for it, then there is a fair chance, not an inevitable, but a fair chance that the world that we pass on to our children and grandchildren will not be as good as the one that we inherited and that I enjoyed so much when my knees and ankles and elbows and everything worked. So in other words, it's up to us to work out all of that, what we want to do, what sort of Australia, what sort of world, what sort of influence do we want as Australians to have on the world that we want to build, and we need to set out our path accordingly, and we need to do something about it. But in recent years, I think that we've taken the other way. We've taken a different path. Policies are introduced, they're changed, they're rescinded, according to the politics of the moment. whichever those politics happen to be. Any or all of those policies may be good in themselves, but the real question, as I just said, the real question is, what do they all add up to? Isn't the important thing the role that each one plays when it comes together with all the others in establishing the very nature of the country that we're building, the very character of the country that we're trying to build? And the best analogy I could think of when we were preparing these words is that I don't think you'd go out and buy a truckload of bricks and just presume that you had a house. You'd know what sort of house you wanted to build, and then you'd go and buy the bricks accordingly, and then you'd use them to build it. And we tend not to do that with something as important as science. We've got a lot of bricks. We could build a big house with the number of bricks we've got, but we don't actually have that overarching vision for what it should be turned into and how that makes Australia better, both for the coming generations and for Australia's place in what is characteristically a fairly hostile world. So yes, we do hear from various sectors that we must get the budget under control because it wouldn't be fair on our children and grandchildren. And I do agree that presenting our future generations with a debt-free country is a good objective. Yet I'm intrigued that we don't put out there what the country should look like and then get all the pieces in place to get us there. And naturally, probably given my role, I'm also intrigued at how we selectively use the arguments about intergenerational equity. We don't pursue the same argument, for example, when it comes to other important matters, like climate change, to illustrate the point. In the latter case, climate change, some of us seem to think that if we ignore the evidence, then it can't be happening. Or because we can't project a single temperature point out of all the models, then they're all wrong. And we're encouraged to ignore them, each and every one. And we're encouraged to ignore them by people who use economic models in their daily lives every day. And we speculate on the value of the dollar, the interest rates, the unemployment rates, this and that. And we even do that within an hour of the Reserve Bank announcing what's going to happen to interest rates. We get people on the radio saying, I think they'll go up. Not all of them say that all the time, but we take that as okay. But something like climate change, which is just as profound and could have just as profound an impact on future generations as anything I can think of, we just say, can't get a single temperature point, so ignore it. In other words, why worry about accumulating evidence when talkback radio has all the answers? But fortunately for us, not everybody thinks like that. Lloyd's of London, the well-known insurance market, recently released a report called Catastrophe Modelling and Climate Change. And in that they say, and I quote, "The Earth's global climate system is warming. This conclusion is supported by a large body of evidence which is presented in the scientific literature. Increasing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, largely due to human activity such as combustion of fossil fuels and land use change, result in an enhancement of the planet's natural greenhouse effect and an increased surface warming. Business is taking action. Paul Polman, who's the chief executive of Unilever, said recently, left unchecked, climate change has the potential to become a significant barrier to our growth strategy and that of just about every other company. So would you label them and all the others a bunch of alarmist lefties trying to destroy the free enterprise system? I don't think you would, actually. I think you'd probably imagine them to be prudent assessors of risk and managers of risk, and I think you'd be much more likely to think of them in those terms. So while insurers are preparing for the changing climate's impact on extreme weather events and businesses factoring climate change into forward planning, we don't even have a sensible debate about the prudent steps we could take to ensure that we leave our children and grandchildren a flourishing planet, as well as a debt-free Australia. And yes, I am one of those who thinks that science, technology, engineering and mathematics will be central to how we respond to these challenges, all the challenges that confront us, and how we take the opportunities to secure a better future. So a bit of good news is that we have good science, we have good potential, and we have many opportunities. And of course we have the need. The less good news is that we don't have a strategy for science. So science is the victim of on-again, off-again policies, too often short-term, too often based on terminating programs, And when they're on, they're not necessarily connected to all the other elements that will make and keep Australian science strong. What is the point, for example, in having a view about where we can take research or innovation, or about how we might get the maximum bang for our buck from our research investments, if we don't worry about our education system and its capacity to provide the talent and skills that we need to deliver on our expectations? We have a view in Australia that we can do what we've always done, wait for something good to come along because it has. We've always thought that if we have a deficit in talents and skills to do something, we can go into the international market and bring people in. But I think that just as we think about food security and energy security and all of this stuff which gets a good run in the media on a regular basis, we also need to think in Australia about a talent and skills security, that we actually do make sure that we invest in the right way to get the maximum amount of talent and skill potential in our community as we can, and if we still have deficits, then we'll go and see what the international market can provide. But it's not the same international market that it used to be. I read an article in the plane over, I was in Perth this morning, I came over, read this article about how the Department of Homeland Security in the United States is now relaxing its visa rules to bring more people into the United States. The UK has already done it, Europe is doing it. So when we go out there fishing in the pond for high talent and high skills, we will get some, but we can't depend on it in the way that we probably once could. So we have trade agreements that commit to increasing agricultural exports to our partners, and at the same time our researcher population ages and our undergraduate numbers in agricultural science fall. And we know it's happening, we watch it happening. We've seen it drop by about 40% over the last decade in agricultural science, might have gone up a little bit this year, but very small. So how can we deliver on these legally binding agreements unless we begin to think through the implication from this fine policy out here, trade agreement, increasing agricultural exports, more jobs, all of that's good. Down here, we've got a pipeline that starts with the education system, which is actually not providing the wherewithal to deliver on that unless we do something about it, unless we see the connections between all these elements. Because there is almost nothing that I can talk about with respect to science, technology, engineering and mathematics that is not connected to some other aspect of our world. And we've got to take it into account. We've got to be comprehensive, we've got to be big thinking about it, and we've got to be a bit daring. So a good science policy will be a comprehensive science policy. It should start with education, it should progress through research, it should cover international engagement, and it should lead to an adaptive knowledge-based economy that we will need when the resources boom fades. At some time in the future, we'll get to the bottom of the hole in the Pilbara. Unless we're coming out the other side of the earth, there may be enough in there for us to get that deep, but probably not. So what are we going to do? If it happened tomorrow afternoon, we would be in deep trouble. If the price of iron ore goes down further, as has been coming down over the last few weeks, we would be in deep trouble because we haven't planned with a long enough lead time, a long enough run at it, to enable us to say we have a diverse, adaptive, solid economy based on multiple sectors contributing to it, and of those, science, STEM, is an important part. So science could do it. So again, I think there is some good news, and I hope that some good news will come as at least light relief for all of us, given the week that we've just been through. But what have scientists imagined that the way the world might be, based on what they know is possible just today? So we commissioned a series of essays for the Conversation online journal from a series of scientists to ask them how they thought their discipline or their area would contribute to an Australia of the future, an Australia by 2025. And they wrote 1,400 words or so, and we had 200-word additional contributions on each discipline. And I thought I might just give you an illustration of 4. Michelle Simmons in physics said, and I quote, "We're just beginning now to tap into new technologies that are based upon the mysterious wonders of quantum physics. The ability to manipulate individual atoms, molecules and photons of light, and to exploit quantum effects that are imperceptible in the macroscopic universe foreshadows a future where the communication and processing of information is radically enhanced from where we are today." Andrew Holmes talked about chemistry. "It's not too fanciful," he said, "to imagine a new class of antibiotic using a delivery system that enters bacterial cells carrying a built-in warhead that explodes and shatters the cell wall, destroying the bacterium." And I suggest to you we need it, because we all know that we're facing a future where the antibiotics that we've depended on are much less useful than they used to be, and we need more and more defences against microbial infections. Peter Doherty on medical science. By 2025, he wrote, "The advances that emerge from the broad screening programs such as the Australian initiated and led Human Variome Project will have likely led to greatly improved diagnostics and will hopefully be enabling the transition to more precisely targeted therapies for, say, particular subsets of cancers." Fits well with the Treasurer's rhetoric of the moment that we will cure cancer in our time. As I reminded them in the press, Richard Nixon said that in 1971, and we're still having the same discussion now. Although I will say, on the other side, that an enormous amount of good science was done by the funding that the US governments put in to what they then called in 1971 the war on cancer. So a lot of what we do today, a lot of what we know today, a lot of the technology we use today came out of that era, or was initiated, or started with that investment of funding. Nalini Joshi wrote about mathematics. "How does genomic information lead to development and better health in early life? How can the resolution of medical images be improved while reducing their file size? How can mathematics be used to create a safer regulatory framework for financial markets? The more technologically sophisticated a society becomes," she wrote, "the more critical its need for mathematical thinking. The pathways towards economic diversity and opportunity are paved with mathematics." Very poetic for a mathematician. So, I forgot there are probably mathematicians in the audience. Yeah. I'm sure you could all have written that. So, anyway, some of us at least are positive about what science can do to influence our future. But I also wanted to give you some less good news, and I think to my way of thinking, we have to actually state how we are and what we are in very clear terms. Because it's like all these things, you can overstate how good you are and people will treat you with little respect because they'll say, "Oh, well, they're so good we can trim a budget here or cut a budget there and it won't have any impact." If we actually say how it is, then you are able to make a case differently. It might be the same case, but you'll make it differently. So the less good news is that we've analysed the citation rates on a field-weighted basis of some 91 STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics subfields, or more specialised areas, against the top group of European countries in the US. Now, we chose the top group of European countries to include Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland and the UK. And we did that because we were responding to a request from the previous Prime Minister, previous to the previous Prime Minister, so Julia Gillard, and she said, "Well, it's all right to compare us, with the world or something. I mean, if we can't be better on average than the world, then we're not very good at all. So let's pick some countries that we could be like or that would have similar systems to us or similar embedded scientific cultures to us." And you look at the Western European democracies whose activity in this area has perhaps gone on a little longer than ours, but they are democracies. Politicians have got to respond to their constituents. There are financial issues, there are investment issues and so on. So they're the countries we chose. And if you looked at the 91 subfields against those countries, then we are ahead in 16 of those 91. And they include statistics, geology, civil engineering, medical biochemistry and metabolomics, which is the study of chemical processes involving metabolites, which might have applications in personalised medicine. And I had to read that out to you because I didn't know what it meant. But I think I would argue that being best of the best in 16 out of 91 subfields is not good enough for us. We ought to be better than that. I don't know how much better, but we ought to focus on where can we get better, not assume that because we're ahead in 16 out of 91, well, that's good enough, and somebody will go out there and say, oh, we punch above our weight. But when you look at the weight class we punch in, we're not in the right one. So we've got to do something about that. And of course, some of those subfields are really remarkably small. Some of them are the other category, where we categorise things that we can't categorise. And some of them, of course, are very tiny publication output. But our overall research performance is not strong either. We do sit above the world average in nearly everything, or everything except one. But we sit below the benchmark set by the European countries in all the areas in which we research. Now, I'm not saying that's horribly bad. I'm not saying that it's catastrophic. I'm not saying it's anything remotely like that. What I'm saying is that once we recognise where we are, we can actually begin to work out what we need to do to get better. But you don't actually find it easy in a position like mine to give advice on how to get better when the response is, well, we punch above our weight already. We don't. But we're not bad. And our best are really very good. So that our share of the top 1% of cited papers has increased over the past decade or so by nearly a factor of 2. So we're much better represented in the most highly cited papers, and of course the caveats are this is academic work, this is academic journals, everybody knows that citation metrics are a bit rubbery. So all I'm saying to you is that these are signposts, not micrometers. They're pointing us in a direction broadly. As I've said before, it's like seeing a street sign on the freeway. It doesn't tell you how many centimetres from Adelaide to Melbourne, it tells you how many kilometres, and even that's approximately right. So that's what we're looking at. So we're looking at a signpost. But if I were to use a cricketing analogy, or even if I were to talk about the Adelaide Crows, I might say that you've got a few great players, unlike the Swannies, who have a team of great players. But in the case of the Adelaide Crows, the team is average, but you do have some good players. And I wonder how long the public or the media would accept that without biting the head off the selectors or the captain. So we need to think about what our ambition is when it comes to science, or what it should be. We also need to consider where Australia has distinct national needs. Now, our Australian landscape means that we have a continued need to address the challenges of distance, of climate and environment. Along with the rest of the world, we're facing a future where food and water security, climate change and energy requirements will need to be addressed. It is science that will provide the means to manage them, to mitigate, adapt to these challenges, and hopefully in many instances perhaps even solve them. So as a nation, we have a strong history, we have clear areas of advantage, and we have distinct national needs that can only be met by science. I do want to interpolate there that I've never seen and never see and do not advise that science exists somehow in a vacuum all on its own. Science has to work with the community, on behalf of the community, for the community, and with other disciplines to ensure that all of that is kept on the level. Ethical science is important, not any science, ethical science, but ethical science across a broad spread, working with the humanities and social sciences, working with the community, taking the community with us as we do new things. I read in the West Australian this morning that there's a spike in measles outbreak in Western Australia. The spike apparently is mostly in the children of people who refuse to vaccinate their children against measles. And how do we let the community get to the point of view where there are sizable numbers of people who are willing to do that? It's because the scientists stand aloof from the community too often, tell them what's good for them, and then hope that they follow, instead of working with the community, working with what I would call a social contract with the community to make sure that we take the community with us as we try to address some of these really difficult problems. They are contentious. Not everybody agrees that there's anthropogenic global warming. The evidence is pretty strong, but not everybody agrees. So there's no just point in going along saying, I've just discovered, as I read today on the plane on the way over, that the ice shelf in Antarctica is now melting at twice the rate that it was 5 years ago. Well, unless we're explaining some of these issues to the community as we go, and why it's important, A, to know it, and B, when sea levels begin to rise as a consequence of it, what we can do about it, how we manage it, mitigate it, adapt to it or whatever, then we'll find that it's too late because we won't have the community support to do what we need to do, and we won't be doing, therefore, what we need to do. So, Australian science is disconnected and it's fragmented. It's difficult to know with any detail what other parts of the scientific community are doing or how that might impact the next step in the scientific ecosystem, or indeed even in the adjacent space. Researchers themselves face uncertainty as funding schemes and priorities change with regrettable regularity. But most recently, we've seen this play out in the federal budget. There were pluses and minuses, as we all now know. The extension of the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy is an obvious plus, and after a review it might be extended and it may no longer be a terminating program given the Minister's scathing comments about the previous government's use of that approach. The extension of funding to the Australian Research Council for the Future Fellowships Program for mid-career researchers is another plus. It's a substantial plus, but it's set against cuts to the ARC. Funding for the research vessel managed by CSIRO is a plus. It was produced at some cost of close to $200 million, as I recall, but there was no money to run it. So it did its sea trials, I think, around the harbour, and it's been waiting there to get money to run it. So now there is money to run it, put into CSIRO's budget, but that's set against cuts to the CSIRO budget. We saw the Cooperative Research Centre funding cut back, thereby halting the current funding round, as we lament, almost it seems to me daily, lament the state of industry research collaboration in this country and how poor it is by comparison with what happens in other countries whose economies are transitioning from what they used to be to what they want them to be. We see changes to higher education which could have profound impact on the study profiles of students, and when it does that, it has a profound effect on the staff and staffing, and hence the research profile in the university sector. And that's of particular significance to us in Australia because more than 60% of our nation's researchers are employed by the universities. There's the Medical Research Future Fund. Now I need to be careful. Good in principle, but until we know the rules, we won't have any idea how it will affect the rest of the research system on which medical research depends. Medical research itself does not exist in isolation, as I said in an interview. When you think about medical research, it's not some romantic image of an ageing doc taking off a stethoscope and picking up a pipette. It's a person going into a laboratory that's populated with PhDs in physics and chemistry and genetics and microbiology and physiology and pharmacology, and so it goes, working on a problem that does have some implications for health, of course. So it's a bit different, but if you are not providing the support for the people who are actually going to do the work in physics or chemistry or biology, wherever it might be, you're not going to provide the support for the people who actually not only invented the new laser knife or the MRI or the CAT scanner. If you're not going to support for them, where are they going to come from? It's an integrated whole, as I said at the beginning. There are links all the way through. And if we weaken rust, let rust, saw half through, do whatever we want to do to one of the links in the chain, the whole thing's not going to be as strong as it could otherwise be. And that, I'm afraid, takes a more strategic approach. You can't just do it by nicking one link off and saying it'll all be okay. You have to actually think through the implications of this a little more, so when we see the rules for the Medical Research Future Fund, we'll have a better idea on how it will impact positively the research system in Australia. Margaret Shield, who's the Provost of the University of Melbourne, where presumably a fair bit of the Medical Research Future Fund money will be spent, was quoted as saying, "There are so many issues around research in this budget, it's hard to be celebrating this one bit." So it is how all the bits fit together that's important for us to know. Discoveries made in virtually every discipline have made our lives better today, and there is no way we can predict with any certainty where the next world-changing discovery is coming from. So put simply, science is the platform to build sustained growth. As I said earlier, not on its own, integrated in, but you can't do without it. Think of the big challenges that confront us as Australians. Think of the big challenges that confront countries in our neighbourhood. Think of the big challenges that confront the planet. And find me a few, two will do, find me two, where science isn't embedded somewhere in how we will go about solving it, mitigating it, managing it or adapting to it. Scientific knowledge, scientific understanding. The UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, said in a speech recently, and I quote, "We've had to make difficult choices to cut public spending. The easy route would have been to cut science spending, but it would have been painful for the economy and the wrong answer for Britain. It would have completely undermined our long-term economic prospects. I know that certainty is absolutely vital if you want to attract investment from businesses and charities, if you want to attract world-class researchers and research projects and global businesses to Britain, if you want to embark on the most ambitious long-term projects that might previously have seemed unreachable." So it won't surprise any of you that I fully endorse Mr Osborne's view, and I hope that his intuitive understanding of the role science plays in any developed nation's economic future will be better understood here. And I see that we still have an opportunity. We can take these changes in science funding and work them into a whole-of-government strategy for reinvestment. It's possible to do things differently. It's not easy to do things differently, I might add, but it's possible. And we can shape the destiny of our nation, and we can achieve sustained economic growth. But to do that, to do what we need to do, we need a plan. We need a plan to underpin our investment in science. We need a plan to identify what our national needs are, what our research priorities are, where we have advantage that we can use, and how we can integrate with countries, other countries in the world, and particularly countries in our region, to make sure that we make the region a better place for us all. Other countries are doing it. They're investing strategically in science for the long haul. The United Kingdom, the EU, Canada, the United States, China, South Korea, and many, many other countries around the globe have all prioritised science funding as an important foundation for future sustained growth, and many of those countries are suffering what they might call fiscal uncertainty. I'm not alone at arriving at this conclusion. Many, like the Business Council of Australia, say such a strategy is critical to growth. Others, like Roy Green, who's the head of the Business School at University of Technology, Sydney, warn of dire consequences if we choose not to take the action needed to transform our economy. Last week he wrote, and I quote, "This is the rub. Without world competitive knowledge-intensive industries, including advanced and specialised manufacturing, which can capture value from global markets, we face the prospect of our very own Argentina moment. This is when a first world lifestyle dependent on the import of high-value consumer goods can no longer be supported by a third world economic structure based on the export of unprocessed raw materials. Surely we cannot allow it to do that," he said. And I agree with him. If we want to shape our destiny for a more positive future, are we prepared to change in order to achieve it? Are we prepared to do what we need to do to achieve it? But is our big goal to hand this country over, to hand this world over to the coming generations in a better shape than it was handed to us? And I hope the answer to that is yes, because if it is yes, then we'll actually be galvanised into doing something. Thank you. So now it's your chance to ask me what you actually wanted me to talk about. Anybody got a question?
So thank you. When I heard the title, I thought I was coming to the shortest talk I've ever been to. After the last week, that is the future of Australian science.
Oh.
But you did a great job. One of the things that's really frustrating is seeing waste. And you talked about the citation, our fascination with citation and rankings on one aspect, important, but one aspect of research that's driven things for the last decade. I mean, the previous Liberal government had its system, then Labor came along and made a system, and it measures something, and it's important, But I estimate that that measurement process has taken, because every university games it, the ERA, right? Every university games it. Everybody has modelled it. I guess that between the direct expenditure in the ARC and the expenditure in the universities, we've spent close to $1 billion, maybe $750 million on the ERA process. And you could tolerate that if the promise that the infrastructure funding which is needed for science, in universities in particular, which every review for the last 20 years has said is way short of what's required, if that money had appeared. But rather than that money coming and supporting the strong science that's identified in ERA, bugger all has happened. It just keeps disappearing. And we keep spending money on the measurement process and nothing comes to do science. Do you see any way forward there?
Changing it. I mean, so what you say is correct. We do indeed spend a lot of time, measuring our performance and making assessments and building the signposts and so on, which I think are important. But it hasn't been connected to for example, the infrastructure funding in the way that you and I would agree it should. Part of the problem, I think, and again where I think the rest of the world has moved and we've been much slower, is that they are willing to say that there are some things that we must do and there are some things that we probably can't. And we've not been willing to do that. So we had a visit from the British Minister for Universities, whose nickname is Two Brains because they think he's really smart, and he does have a view of these things which is really interesting to get up close and to talk to him about. But they've just announced, for example, their 8 great technologies, and they're putting a big chunk of their budget behind those 8 great technologies which meet some criteria. Britain's got talent and capacity, it's got a need, it's got all of these sorts of things. And we talked to him about picking winners, and he said, oh, well, we're past that. We think that, we just can't fund it all, and as a consequence we have to concentrate. Some of our funding is important to note, not all of our funding, so there's still room for the idiosyncratic juniors coming up through the system. But so some of our money in these areas because we can make a difference. In Australia we've taken a different approach. We break things up into very small parcels. So we might say we're going to do this about that, and then we divide it up into 5 programs, each of which is small. If anyone goes belly up, no minister is seriously embarrassed. Most of our money, with some notable exceptions, but even where there are pockets of money identified, so CRCs, it's essentially, for the most part until the last couple of years, a bottom-up driven process. Who can get together, who can put in an application, who can stand the vetting process, and who comes out the top with some money. So we get a further diffusion of our effort. And so I think that one of the ways forward in this is to, again, and I don't want to keep going back to the same thing, but it is about making sure that the links between all these things are actually understood. If you are going to have an error, then it might, and you're going to go to the expense of doing it, and you're going to game the system and all that sort of stuff. If you game it well and nobody notices, you might as well get some benefit from having done it. And at the moment it's too disconnected from the rest. It has a marginal impact on the rest. So when you look at all these programs that are sitting around where it could be used to influence at least a proportion of the spend, selectively, with strengths, with national needs, all of those things lined up against it, then we will have moved, we will have changed. We will have politicians who don't flinch at the notion of picking winners, like they've given up in the EU as a federation, they've given up in the UK. In the US, they've been prioritising their research expenditure for 40 years. And we think of it as the land of the free, where everything, just a bucket of money tossed up in the air, and if you can grab some, you grab some. It's not like that at all for a chunk of the money. For some it is. So I think it's that next level of maturity where we say, well, look, there are things we've got to do, but it goes all the way back. There's no point in talking about exploiting our shale gas reserves if we've closed down mining engineering in every university because they're all acting independently of each other and it's expensive and the student numbers are not high. All of those sort of things need to be brought into the equation, and then we have to change the way we do. So that means we've got to change the way we do it. That's a cultural issue, and the culture's pretty hard to change. But we don't try. I'll be back in 25 years, you'll be sitting there and you'll be asking me the same question.
Professor, thanks for the presentation. I was going to ask you a question about deregulation of universities, and I thought that would all be too messy. So I'm going to move on to something a bit simpler, maybe simpler. I was really struck by a figure you quoted in your speech, and I may be remembering it wrong, but you said that something like 60% of all researchers in Australia reside within universities. Yeah. Can you give a sense of a comparison? How does this align with the countries we're trying to compete with? Do you think there are opportunities perhaps for private research opportunities, perhaps to incentivise study science and to offer, current researchers, mid-career researchers, greater opportunities to commercialise their research?
I mean, all of those are very real and very valid questions. So the countries that are, so we have about 60, bit over 60% of our researchers in universities. We have about another 10 to 15% in publicly funded research agencies, CSIRO and the like, and we have the rest in business, which is almost the mirror image of the United States. 20% in universities, and the rest are mostly in business. And then the other countries, the European ones that I read out, would be around 30 to 40% in universities and the rest in business. So we are abnormally overrepresented in the higher education system, if I can put it that way, by comparison with them. And there are 4 countries like us down that end of the scale: Thailand, Malaysia, the United Kingdom and Australia all have around 60 to 65% of their researchers in universities. The striking difference between Australia and the UK is that when you look at how businesses cooperate with universities, about 40% of their businesses cooperate with their universities, and in Australia the figure is a dynamic 4%. And when you look at how that ranks on an international scale, we are 33rd out of 33 countries for cooperation between business and university, small to medium and large, about 4 each. So the British, you would say, well, the British culture is like ours, the British university culture is like ours, the proportion of researchers in universities are like ours, and so how come 40% versus 4? And then you look at what they've done. So it's planned, strategic, they've got a technology strategy board, they identify innovation priorities and they invest in them. And they invest in the people. They've changed their PhD programs to put more industry link into the PhD program, into substantial proportion of them. Now, we do itty-bitty bits of that all over the place, but we don't scale it up. So when things work really well, we don't scale it up. It's a terminating program or whatever it is, or maybe expensive. So I think we've got too many programs with too little money, too many rules around them, and not enough capacity to scale. And if we could scale, we'd be a lot better off, because we've got some staggeringly good examples of how the cooperation works when it works, how well it works when it works. So somehow we've got to learn from the good, scale it up so we get more of it. So the culture in business, they don't like universities much. They find them difficult to deal with. The universities think, they can go to war over their intellectual property because it's going to solve their financial problems. If they make $1 out of it, they're lucky. But there's a big, it takes 10 months on average to negotiate an IP deal between a university and a company. 10 months with a standard deviation of 6 months. So it's can be pretty slow and tortuous, and they don't like coming back for that. So we've got to change culture on both sides. As I've said before, we each live in our glass house and we throw rocks at each other. And sooner or later we've got to get into the space between the glass houses and work out how to do it better. And we could do it if we wanted to. It's just that we've got to crack the cultural egg in order to cook that omelette. In order to, I'll stop the
Hi, back to metrics. I'm interested in your idea of what metrics could we use to give scientific literacy more political leverage. in terms of programs like the RIOS is doing, like STEM outreach programs, National Science Week, CSIRO Lab on Legs, even CRCs that are building relationships between industry and research. These are all the community outreach programs you're talking about. They're building the educational pipeline. They're creating the dinner table conversations between parents and kids who are our potential scientists. But they're qualitative, long-term outcomes. And we struggle to turn those into quantitative election cycle outcomes, which is where we get this on-off policy. So how do those of us who are working in this long-term scientific literacy state give some form of leverage to the decision makers when we can't give them the sort of numerical metrics that they like to build policy on?
So I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll therefore give some advice. It's because it's a tricky one, but so if I were the Minister for Education in a state, I'd make the learning of the scientific method and the history and philosophy of science compulsory in school, because I think that's where it starts. And I think the problem that you have is that you're going into a community which basically doesn't care. And so you're trying to change the hearts and minds of people who, if ever they did think about or like science, it was a long time ago. And now that they might be more worried about it and see how it's represented in some parts of the media, and some parts of science are represented in some parts of the media. So I think it's difficult. I'm in our plan that we're writing for the Prime Minister on how to take science forward. One of the things that we're highlighting is the Australian attitude to citizen science, which is cursory, if not desultory. So it happens, but it happens because enthusiasts do get together and look at, fish and identify new species or whatever. And it's a website and it's good for the participants, but if you didn't know it existed, you wouldn't look to find it. So I think that we've got to actually bring the whole notion of citizen science and citizen literacy up on the state, territory and national agenda much higher. And when we were writing that part of the plan, it just happened that I was browsing my counterpart's website in the US, and it was a day when President Obama was welcoming the champions of citizen science to the White House. And it got quite a bit of press in the US. It certainly got a lot of press out of the White House itself. And you can see, and I mean, the US has some people in the US, in different parts of the US, have some unusual attitudes to science, but as an attempt to change that, they're actually working with the citizens and bringing it forward and then giving it status and prestige. And I think that would be good. My last bit of advice was that we've got so many programs of the outreach sort that I think that if all the program leaders of the big ones got together and worked out how to be coherent about it, then you'd actually be in a much stronger position than going individually to say, we do something great and somebody else comes in and say, we do. So I do agree that a little bit of competition is helpful, but equally too much can look as though it's just fragmented, incoherent and therefore as a consequence less effective. So it's really a question of how you sort of work out what you can do, each with your own different strengths, and not trample on each other in part of the process. And I think that's important, because when they look for things that they can invest in, I think that they're much more likely to begin to invest in those more strategic aspects where they can get some identifiable traction, action being a key word, and not have, a large number. In fact, there are something to the order of 170 outreach programs around Australia. And a lot of them are little, a lot of them are run by enthusiasts. They affect 4 schools in Western Queensland and they travel hundreds of kilometres to get together and everything. You'd never want to get in the way of any of that. But what you do want to do is to say there is a purpose to all this, and the purpose is to change the entire community's attitude to science. And this is how we're each playing our role.
Thank you very much. How much sympathy do you get from the government for the views which you've expressed tonight? I mean, in particular, you mentioned the fact that we should be handing a legacy on to our children and grandchildren where the planet is in at least as good a condition then as it is now. And as you said, Joe Hockey made a big issue out of not handing on a huge debt to our children and grandchildren. So do you get a good hearing from the ministers when you express the views that you've expressed tonight? Do they seem to agree with what you're saying?
Did you
If
say
so, will they take any action to make it happen?
Did you say do they seem to agree?
Well, yes, or do they appear to agree?
Yeah, they seem to agree. Yeah. Well, look, I'm so deep in my heart, I'm an optimist with a fair layer of pessimism over the top of it, and I try to crack through that from time to time. And I think that the only way you get change in this area is to get a broader community of support for it, because of things we've discussed in other places. And you know, if the community is telling politicians that they want action in a particular area, then they're more likely to get it. And I think that's important, so I do think it's more of a community effort. As far as I'm concerned and the people around me, then I think part of our tactic is to be relentless. I don't think you can give up when you've got something that you can see is very worthwhile and where the risk of not doing something is really great. I gave a speech in Perth last night where I had a little go at economists, which I won't do here, just in case. But but one of the things that I think we've got to do is work out what we need to do to be like what we want to be like, and work out how to fit the economy in to support that vision, rather than work out what we can't do because it's not cost effective right now, or the labour force is different now. I mean, there's a bloke who writes gets a bit of press, who talks about my exaggerated claims for you know, the importance of science and technology, engineering and mathematics. But what he's talking about is the labour market today. When the students who were finishing year 10 were choosing to do science or not science later on for further study, what to do, the labour market that we've got today is different from the one when they were making those decisions. It'll be different when they take their graduate degree, if they're graduates or whatever it might be. So we've actually got to start in a different place and work backwards rather than start where we do start, which is, can we afford it? Is it cost effective? No, so you don't even think about it. I had to wrap up a meeting in Sydney a few weeks ago about fuelling our transport fleet. Now, it turned out, I didn't know it, but it's pretty important because some high proportion, like about 85% of our freight moves by road, and about the same proportion of our fuel is imported. And we've got huge gas reserves. So why wouldn't we be thinking of doing what the US has done and convert a large proportion of its transport fleet into gas? They've invented the engine, they can pull the double Bs, it's not a problem from that technical point of view. But our gas is expensive because we charge ourselves for our own gas world parity pricing, whereas the US have a domestic price, and they only, up until now, they only permit about 15% of their gas to be exported at world parity price. So they're using it, as it were, to help rebuild their economy. And we haven't done that. And before I summed up, a person stood up and said, well, it's just not cost, there's no cost benefit, so we shouldn't even be, we're wasting our time thinking about it. So when you think that there are 3 sea lanes between us and Singapore, where a lot of our fuel comes from, which, as it happened the weekend before this conference, 3 Chinese naval vessels sailed through one of them, to our surprise. I don't know what all these things are doing up here. You know, they could be easily stopped, and we've got 3 days' worth of fuel in our fuel stations around the country. We've got a strategic reserve of about a month or something like that, a relatively small amount. So how would we cope if our fuel supplies were cut off? And we've got, if I can say it this way, truckloads of gas. But right now it's not cost effective, but the cost of doing nothing is potentially huge. So we've actually got to get past all this nonsense and say, this is too important, let's now work out how to do it. And it's the same with these other things. And part of my job is to just be unswervingly, relentlessly pushing it.
I think we'll call a halt to it there.
Just as
Thanks,
well.
Ian.
Oh.
There was somebody else, was there?
Oh, I thought that was...
One more. We'll let you have
I
more.
thought you'd already called a halt. I was,
Last question.
I don't mind, I've got all night.
It's all right, you've probably covered a lot of it anyway, but maybe it's attacking this issue in a slightly different way. You talked a bit about the importance of the social contract.
Mm-hmm.
And arguably, there are various countries, particularly in Europe, where that social contract is in a bit better condition than it is in Australia. Do you see identifiable differences between those countries and what we do here?
So I think that the short answer to that is most probably yes. I think I, for example, was completely struck by Tony Blair's Prime Minister of the UK, of Britain, and well, he was when he said it, to the Royal Society, I think it was 2001 or 2, when he said, you know, science doesn't absolve us from moral choices. Science gives us the information from which we should make choices. And I think they do that much better than we do. Is it perfect? Of course not. Nothing that involves all that many human beings will be perfect, but is it better than we do? I think it is. So what are you seeing? You're seeing a much more open dialogue about a lot of things than we might have had. We're changing, and I think, you know, from a very personal point of view, because I got tossed into this climate change thing quite late. I'd thought about it, read about it, you know, looked at stuff. But it was only when people started sending me vile emails, because I dared mention climate change, that I thought I'd better know more about it than I did. And you see, what I think happened was that we spent a lot of techo talk time on the community almost at the end of a process, rather than from early on, and bringing them along with us as things changed and what the implications might be, so that it was explained and they understood. And I don't know that we've ever talked seriously enough about the ethical standards that scientists expect of scientists, and how that then protects the community from the rogues. So go back to measles that I mentioned earlier. We all know the story. This bloke published his paper. The problem with the internet age is you can go back and find that paper today, and if you don't take the effort to find out what the consequences of that were and what happened afterwards, you could believe that. And you think it's bad for your kids, so you don't vaccinate. And I know that in the UK, they have a big spike in measles in the 17 or 18-year-old group, because they were not vaccinated because of this guy who 6 or 8 months later was shown to be a fraud and deregistered and all of that sort of stuff. But if you didn't look for that, you'd say this is good. So we've got a problem with the way information is there forever, and it takes assiduous work to follow up something that was done then to make sure that it's still valid, and some people do that. So the alternative for us is to get out there and explain how science works, how the peer community catches you in the end. It's hardly worth doing it, even if you were inclined, because the peer community does regulate very well. The very processes of science are protective. And they're genuine and real, and the community needs to understand it. They need to understand that people who are telling them things that they might not want to hear, like sea level has gone up 20 centimetres in the last 75 years, and if the Antarctic ice sheet is melting at the rate that it is now, in another 50 years it'll be another 40 or 50 centimetres high. All of those sorts of things. But you need to tell them early and take them through, and make sure they understand that this is done by an ethical bunch of people using measurements, not fudging the data, putting it out there and telling them the story as it unfolds, rather than just saying, well, you know, move your house in 2050. A bit late then.
Well, thank you, Ian. Courtesy of Rob Lewis, I've got a bit of a tome to give you on the history of the way, a book that was, I understand, released last week.
Oh, thank you.
I hope you'll enjoy
Thanks,
reading
Tom.
that. And thanks
Thanks very much.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I want to thank the Department of Further Education, Employment, Science and Technology for supporting this evening, and also the other functions that are arranged around the Forum of Chief Scientists meeting. I think you'll agree we've had a privilege of hearing some wise words from Ian, who's in the very key role that he's got nationally at the centre of the wheel, and I think my personal opinion is, I think even though we haven't got a designated science minister federally, as long as Ian's there, I think there's some sign of life, and I hope we can look forward to the optimism that's beneath all that pessimistic outer coating. Thanks again, Ian, for coming along tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening, folks.